Oh, lovely, thank you. Um, Today we're going to be talking about the indispensability of net zero targets, and I suppose the first thing I should do is remind you what a net zero target is. So net zero targets are very different from zero emissions. The point of a net zero target is to make emissions possible, but at least theoretically, using carbon accounting to balance the impact of emissions with removals. And thinking about the most productive way to think about net zero targets, ideally you imagine them as balancing hard to abate residual emissions with removals. And that, I think, is the sort of core idea behind the idea of net zero targets. Unfortunately, as they are mostly practiced, net zero targets have a sort of double impact of inadequately encouraging us to reduce emissions, while at the same time providing contrary incentives to defer or even entirely avoid investment in emissions reduction. How's that going? I can wait if you like.
That's brilliant.
Oh, super. So you see, I have up here the IPCC's very generous acknowledgement that philosophy can occasionally matter. I just thought I'd give you a little context about that. Welcome, Trent. There's space in the middle and the front. To put that in context, they were talking about what it would take for society to be able to respond flexibly and with innovation to the uncertainty that we face when we ask ourselves, what sorts of changes do we have to make to the way we relate to ourselves if we can expect to continue to flourish now and in the future? And after considering that question for a while, the IPCC said, well, sometimes religion and philosophy can help.
Really sorry.
It's all right.
I'm really confusing myself here.
So I've summarized my argument there. I'll be making it over the next few while. This isn't an outline so much as what I'm thinking about. We have this problem. We find ourselves in Anthropocene conditions. I'll talk about those for a minute. We have very clear reasoning that points us to what we need. Namely, we need to achieve climate stability so that we can enjoy the sorts of conditions that we've enjoyed for the last 12,000 years that of relative predictability when it comes to the conditions that allow us to do things like plant crops and live on coasts and stuff like that. So it's easy to know what we want. And in order to get that, we need coordination. But we can't have the kind of coordination that we need to achieve that. All we have is this sort of embattled, imperfect, bottom-up targeting regime that, as I'll talk about later, is more or less inadequate, only ever partly effective. So how can we respond to that? At that point, I turn to, taking the IPCC's advice, philosophy, my favorite, Immanuel Kant, who I think is a really comforting and thoughtful source of advice on the situation in which we find ourselves, which is we cannot have what we know we need. How can we respond to that? Okay, so starting with what it means to be here in the Anthropocene era. So I love this little graph that's available on Wikimedia. This is where we are. We are in still, this is RCP 8.5, so I wouldn't worry too much about this yet. As you know, the precursors to the AR7 next IPCC report that's going to be emerging in the next few years have already decided to remove the most sort of the worst case scenario from futures planning. It's no longer plausible, and that's something that we can chalk up, at least in part, to the existence of these net zero regimes that are so inadequate. So they're not wholly inadequate. At any rate, we won't worry about this yet. What we'll worry about is maintaining this, because you can see from the context of the long view of world history that the last 12,000 years has been unusually stable. And it certainly would be delightful to continue to inhabit that stability. So as many of you probably know, there was a movement to convince the International Union of Geological Scientists to rename our current geological era, which is the Holocene, to rename it to the Anthropocene. And the argument for this is that human beings have now left indelible marks on the geological record. And many people think that the most sort of smoking gun indelible mark on the geological record is the isotopic residue of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons tests. There's also an indelible geological record associated with things like early agriculture and deforestation. So there's not much argument that there is a human species caused, legible for all time, in principle, imprint on the geological record of the planet that we inhabit together. And the Geological Union, although you decided not to call it a new era, has labeled the Anthropocene an event. It is a serious shift in all of Earth systems functioning based on the behavior of a single species. So Anthropocene individuals, they affect everything on the planet, human and non-human, now and in the future. And that's a sort of different kind of way of being than most of our modes of mediating each other have anticipated, as I'm going to talk about. So if you think about the different planetary boundaries, the things that make it possible for us to continue to flourish as we have in the Holocene period. All of them, as you can see, and as you probably already know, well, nearly all of them are in the danger zone. But the one that's most widely understood is the climate change planetary boundary. There's a widespread understanding that the planet, due to human released greenhouse gases, has warmed too far beyond pre-industrial norms. And that if we don't keep it preferably below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial norms, but at the very sort of worst case, below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial norms, the impacts are going to be so severe that they're likely to interfere with our capacity to flourish now and in the future. As we all know, every fraction matters. But before I go on to talk in more detail about the net zero regime specifically, I want to spend some time thinking about what isn't so widely understood. Because although our friends and colleagues tend to understand that, global heating is a thing, what I think they really don't understand is the narrowness of the window that we are facing. This is true. I assume most of you in the room understand these things with me, and therefore you have similar pain when everybody else doesn't seem to treat this as something new under the sun that it really is. So if you think again about what I just mentioned, that the people who are planning for the next round of IPCC reports have decided to narrow their range of plausible future scenarios, eliminating what was in the last round, the worst case scenario, and making the best case scenario of staying below 1.5 very unlikely. When this came out, this paper advocating for removing scenarios, American President Donald Trump said, "See, I told you so, it was all already a hoax." And I want to say, our friends and our colleagues, they are not like Mr. Trump, but they still are operating under what I would say is a really quite serious lack of urgency about the problem. And I want to spend a few minutes exploring why with you. So there are lots of cognitive biases that we can identify that will explain why our friends and colleagues are so attached to behaving as if that we're not experiencing the Anthropocene event, as if everything is just fine. And I'll talk about some of those In a few minutes, I'll talk about things like wishful thinking and about availability bias. But I want to start out with a really fundamental point that was first made clear to me by former president of the American Economics Society, George Akerlof, in 1991. And Akerlof wrote what has been for me a really seminal paper on procrastination and obedience. And he opened it with quite a cool anecdote, I think. So Akerlof said, one day I got a gig in India. It was a really lovely research gig. And I intersected with my friend George Stiglitz in India. He was on his way back to California, and I was just arriving, and we had the same office. And Stiglitz said to Akerlof, look, I have to hurry back and teach. Could you please post this box of papers to me back at our office in Berkeley? And Akerlof is a nice guy. He cares about his relationship with Stiglitz. He said, of course. Well, after that, every single day, he arrived at his office and looked at the box. And he was presented with a choice. Do I go and stand in line at the post office for what would have been several hours? Or do I do the work I know I can do in this precious time away from teaching and all the sort of hubbub of normal academic life? And every day he made a judgment that the thing he could see right in front of him, the positive utility associated with an uninterrupted morning's work, was more valuable than going to the post office that day, even though he knew he needed to be the guy who would do his friend the favor he promised. He did not want to consider the possibility that he wasn't the kind of person who would mail a box to his friend who needed it. And that never even entered his mind as a possibility, the possibility of never doing the thing that was required. Instead, he said to himself, oh, I'll just do it tomorrow. But of course, the conditions he faced the next day were exactly the same as the conditions he faced the first day. I really think Akerlof's lesson on what he calls dynamic inconsistency, this source of sort of permanent irrationality in our judgments, where we're actively deferring things that we know are binding goals on us. And yet we're not admitting we're deferring them, we're not admitting we're making them unlikely. Instead, we're saying to ourselves, they're just as likely as they were before because tomorrow is the same as today. The only difference is right now I can see very clearly how great it is to hang out in my office and do my work. Needless to say, at the end of the story, what happened was Akerlof shamefacedly carried the box by hand at the end of his 6-month research leave and had to admit to his friend that he wasn't the kind of guy he thought he was. So there is a well-known response to dynamic inconsistency. Everybody knows that the response to dynamic inconsistency is the commitment mechanism. Right? We all have this same weakness. Right? As Jan Elster has explained beautifully, Ulysses knew he was weak and he took action to allow himself to enjoy the Song of the Sirens while not dying by constraining his own choice. Right? So commitment mechanisms are the way that we get out of dynamic inconsistency. And we, in fact, when we think about our version of Akerlof's package that he has to send to Stiglitz, right? Our version is sufficient emission reduction to guarantee climate stability so we can continue to enjoy Holocene conditions. Right? We know that that's our goal. There's no debate, no serious debate. And yet we know that every day what we would prefer to do is business as usual because tomorrow will be just fine for time to reduce emissions. And unfortunately, the commitment mechanism that we're using is the Paris Agreement, which is based on net zero rationality, which has a bunch of structural flaws that I'm about to discuss with you. And so I debated whether I should say this, but I'm just going to do it, even though it's terribly shameless. I want to stretch this analogy as far as it will go. What did I write? I said, we have talked our shipmates into loosening our bonds so much that we are in danger of death by siren. That's pretty horrible, but I can't help myself. At any rate, that's where we find ourselves today, I argue. So there are some other important reasons why our friends and colleagues don't have the same sense of urgency that we do. There's this problem with baseline syndrome where if you don't remember a Wellington where there weren't regular floods, then you might not think that this is unusual. There's, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, availability bias, which can really turn immoral quite quickly. If you find yourself in a relatively privileged position and this is all you ever see, then you can presume that everybody in the world has the same sort of decision mechanism that you do. And as we're going to see, that's just not true. And now I want to talk just a few more minutes about this really serious other one, wishful thinking. Right? It's wishful thinking that tomorrow will be the same as today, right? Every time we add emissions to the global sink, we're actually making it worse for ourselves. Tomorrow is not the same as today, but we really wish it were because we would rather not embark on that difficult task of emission reduction. And, despite the fact that there are some promising trends, right? We don't see emission reduction yet, but we can see reduction in rates of emission growth. It's always the hockey stick, right? The reduction in emission is always right around the corner. Despite these promising trends, I think one of the wishful thinking things that most of our colleagues and friends are doing right now is they're sort of secretly hoping that technology will save us. And I want to examine this argument for a few minutes. So there's not much uncertainty about the fact that there will be new technology, right? It comes along all the time. Economists can talk to us about the conditions that affect the rates of new technology. But what economists can't tell us, I would say, we'll see if Trent agrees, what they can't tell us is what the societal effect of new technology is going to be, right? You can imagine the rate of production would respond to things like investment and population and other conditions. But I put to you that anybody who guessed a few years ago that the benefits in cheap, low emission energy production that we have enjoyed from the massive rollout of renewables, which are much cheaper and much more widespread than they were before. How many of you guessed that roughly that would be balanced by the same order of magnitude of new energy demand that we are using on data centers and large language models? But you would have had to be very lucky. If you were that person, I want to follow you on Polymarket. I mean, nobody knew that, right? So yes, there's going to be new technology, but no, I don't think we cannot rely on being able to predict new technologies' effects. So somebody who has written about this super well is my philosophy colleague up in Auckland, Tim Mulgan. And Tim Mulgan imagines a circumstance where it's a sort of not too distant future on Earth, and we have made all the wrong choices. We're way beyond the too little, too late scenario. And in fact, we no longer enjoy climate stability. And the people in what he calls the broken world have difficulty predicting when they can plant crops and where they can live, and those sorts of things on a day-to-day basis. And all of the sort of normal justice mediating conditions that we have grown to expect, limited at least altruism and the basic conditions of minimal scarcity, all of those are out the window. In Mulgan's broken world, they have to have survival lotteries in order to have anybody make it through the more difficult bottlenecks that climate instability presents them with. And in Mulgan's thought experiment, he uses a time machine to bring a philosopher from the affluent world, that's us now, to visit the philosophy seminar in the broken world. And I think it's really sort of moving and telling what he said. And I recommend that you quote this to your friends and colleagues. Right? So he says, what does he say? He says, literally, drawing on the affluent faith in technology, he, the affluent philosopher, might be sure that human ingenuity must always outweigh the negative impact of climatic variation and uncertainty. And we, the broken world people, can only reply that while this might have happened in a different possible world, it did not actually happen. Right? If we value the prospect of being good ancestors, I think we should think about what it would be like to have to make this argument to a future broken world group. So Mulligan is actually seriously forgiving about why affluent people haven't reached decisions that would allow them to avoid this situation. And he says they lacked the imaginative resources to change their society sufficiently to make the decisions they needed to make to prevent the advent of climate instability. And I really hope Mulligan is wrong, right? Let's hope that we do have the imaginative resources to make that hockey stick a not permanently receding thing, to actually make a commitment mechanism that works for us so that we can in fact achieve the goal that everybody recognizes is the rational one. Oops. We find ourselves in a situation where we know what we need and we cannot have it. And if we think about net zero targets, we know what we want them to do, right? We want them to reduce emissions quickly enough and substantially enough so that we can achieve climate stability. And yet, the net zero targets are no match currently for the basic logic of collective action, right? Where in the absence of some sort of Leviathan, which we're certainly not going to get, it's just far too tempting to free ride on other people's purported willingness to reduce their emissions and enjoy the short run benefits of unlimited emission reduction yourself today. But this is a really familiar problem. This is a bit of a tough graph to read, but I think it's an important one, so I put it up. I just want to point out before I talk further that what we're measuring here is the change in predicted temperature rise. So it looked worse before the Paris Agreement. The modeled likely temperature rise in 2100 at the end of the century was above 5. And since 2015, when we got this Paris Agreement, the predicted 2100 temperature has been declining. Not enough, but still declining. Right, so we can see partial success of the Paris regime. Emissions, like I said, it's a hockey stick. Emissions are still rising, but we have some reasons for optimism. We want to figure out how we can get to a world that is better, how we can actually implement commitment mechanisms that will work to bring us to where we know we need to go. So why aren't they working? Right? Everybody has reasonable criticisms of Kyoto, and Paris has some really nice elements of, bottom-up self-monitoring and top-down distribution and increasing ambition of targets. So there's some really nice elements to Paris. Why is it so inadequate at achieving what we needed to do? Well, the main problem is the obvious one is simply not reducing emissions enough. And there's some background geophysical reasons for that. The way the carbon cycle works means that this unofficial dream of emitting all we want while balancing it with removals, rather than reserving removals for hard to abate emissions and continuing to invest in the dream of a low emission economy, right? That sort of unofficial dream that is motivating so much procrastination when it comes to investing in this longer term infrastructure we need to get to a low carbon economy. The unofficial dream is just geophysically utterly implausible for lots of interesting reasons that you can read about in these texts I've cited, and I'm happy to talk about later. But there's a second really important problem, and that's a mismatch in terms of both the agents and the time frame of this supposed balancing, right? It's a plausible story that reaching net zero with a bit of net negative would allow us to enjoy climate stability. But that story only works over the long run in the global level, geophysically. And yet what our instrument does, what the policy that we're relying on does, the instrument works locally and over the short run, right? So we say, I'm going to make some steel here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I haven't installed my new electric arc furnace yet. And so there's a bunch of emissions, and I'm going to balance those emissions by buying credits from somebody who's planted a bunch of pine trees. And those two things are treated as equal in the accounting, but of course their geophysical consequences are not at all equal. The emissions are certain, they've happened. There's a lot of uncertainty about the removals, and that's just sort of skimming the very surface of the difficulties. So then we can add to these basic difficulties just a huge long list of all the reasons that net zero accounting is faulty. Recently I noticed that the Germans have written into law since their Supreme Court declared that putting off emissions reduction to the far future was essentially discriminating against the right of future citizens to enjoy the benefits associated with emission, and they said that violated their constitution, and so the Germans had to sort of fix up their emission reduction regime. And lately they've been going back on that, but at any rate, German law now requires that when you decommission a coal-fired energy plant, you have to cancel rather than release the allowances for their emission trading system associated with that plant. And so why would they put that in law if using net zero balancing actually had geophysical effects? In fact, what the law says is we want the zeroing out of our electricity plants to have a geophysical effect. Therefore, we're not going to use this balancing accounting logic at all. I already talked about how the different elements on this different sides of emissions and removals are treated as fungible for accounting purposes, but are in fact not fungible. I talked about how we trade certain immediate emissions for uncertain longer-term gains. One really significant difference between what a successful climate action regime would be and a net zero regime is that the net zero regime allows you to present yourself as climate excellent, while at the same time doing everything in your power to make sure that you delay the advent of a low carbon economy and delay the investments that are required to get there. And we all know about this kind of greenwashing, about this kind of lobbying, right? I mean, I don't know the answer to this yet, but I strongly suspect that the government action with regard to Smith v. Vonterra last week was in response to lobbying by major emitters who are very concerned to present themselves as carbon neutral, and yet are actively working to defer, if not permanently, deny the advent of a low carbon economy. So as I've explained, like there aren't all of the different models that IPCC is working with, they all include removals. Removals are realistic. They're going to be hard to abate emissions, and there's going to have to be a period of net negative. There's not that there's something wrong with the removals per se, but they do have this psychological and, in the end, economic effect that when you can account for emissions, for your emissions quota, either by making a large capital investment in, I don't know, a new electric arc furnace that will permanently reduce your emissions for the activity of your entity, or you can say, well, we don't want to make that big investment today. Instead, we'll just plan on buying offsets from somewhere. Right? You can see why I opened this lecture with Akerlof and Stiglitz, right? I mean, every single day you're faced with this difficult thing that you really should do, which is make the investment, go to the post office. And every single day you say, oh, yeah, it'll be fine. I'll be able to buy offsets. Yeah, so they're subject to lots of different problems. I want to keep moving, so I won't talk more about those, but they're all pretty well known. No, none of that's original to me. Are we? 13. I'm holding this up. Great. So we're saddled with this regime that is better than nothing, and yet we know it isn't getting us where we need to go, and we know that this is coming on us soon. So this image is from the Potsdam Institute, and it is an image of a few months ago, how long we had at current rates of emissions before we hit 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Right? There is a budget. There's a certain amount that we can emit if we want to avoid such and such impacts. And we know that ideally we would distribute shares of that budget, and then everybody would be able to know what their fair share is and plan, and that kind of global level coordination would make it possible for us to really move toward the goal, rather than just say to ourselves, well, you know, we've balanced our individual entity emissions, so it doesn't matter if we're lobbying against the goal or whatever. We can say to ourselves, unlike Akerlof, we have really wholly oriented ourselves to the goal of climate stability, rather than saying we're carbon accounting neutral and that has to be good enough for us. Yeah. So this is the same carbon budget, but if we want to stay at 1.5, and of course 1.5 is a rolling average, and it's very uncertain and nobody knows what the reality of this is, but the Potsdam Institute's best guess in March was 3 more years at current rates. So one of the really nice things about thinking about these sorts of things with Kant is that for Kant, there was a really important distinction between obeying the rules that are set out. He thought for us to treat each other rightly, we really did have to follow the official rules that are available, because those official rules that are available are the thing that makes it possible for us to settle disputes without violence. So even though he knew every existing regime was imperfect, still following the rules of that regime, not undermining at least some mediated form of relation, is always a good thing. But he went further than other social contract theorists, because he said, but you know, it's always imperfect. And you have to think about, not only are you abiding by the official rules that allow us to have relatively civilized relations with each other, when you do that, he would say, you haven't exhausted your moral duties, you've only basically got the baseline down. But next you have to think, how can I orient myself to the goal that I know is mandatory for everybody, that I know is ideal? In Kant's sense, this was perpetual peace and absolute justice. We don't have to be as ambitious as Kant today. All we want is continued policy and climate stability. So you have to think simultaneously, how can I maintain the possibility of civil interaction, of decent, minimally right interaction? And in that case, I think sticking to the net zero system is what current international norms and law prescribe. But Kant would say, you have not exhausted your duties if you're just sticking to these admittedly imperfect rules. You're denying that you're not taking any action to go for what you know you need to do. And so Kant set out a second set of rules where we're supposed to use our own minds to imagine the imperfections in the existing regime and speak out in public about how they can be made better. Another thing that I think is really nice about the Kantian regime is its sort of dual set of moral rules for ordinary people and for people who are in positions of extraordinary power. Right? Ordinary people do, for Kant, have an obligation to call out the difference between the existing imperfect regime that will not get us to the goal we think we know we all need to achieve. But ordinary people are mostly expected not to break the existing rules and to help truth come out about how they can be improved. Whereas people who have extraordinary power, the princes of the world, should recognize the provisionality of their office holding and are required to try to shift the system towards justice. So when Kant asks us, like, how are we supposed to deal with the fact that we know what we need and we know we can't get it? Nihilism is never an answer. Powerlessness is never an answer. According to the capacities everybody has, we have work to do. And we can pursue that sort of two-track model, maintain the possibility of progress that is given to us by the existing imperfect system, while also working to improve it. So I've gone longer than I expected. I'm trying to go quicker. I'm just going to give you a few examples. So for Kant, as I showed you in the last slide, these powerful people who are judging the whole system, they can tell whether they're doing right by asking, could the effective people even potentially approve of this? And I think this is one thing that I also recommend you share with your friends and neighbors who are having trouble following us on this journey. But if you want to know whether a regime is just, you should ask yourself, could the people affected even hypothetically affirm it? And if you ask yourself that about the current net zero regime, which is far too slowly moving us in the direction of eventual emission reduction and exposing the most vulnerable people now and in the future to disproportionate harm, I think it's hard to imagine 100 ordinary people, representative even just of the present people on Earth. It's hard to imagine them endorsing the existing system. I'm going to skip over this. This is just a nice way to think about how you should imagine those other people. Have I treated them as equal justificatory authorities? I would argue we haven't, right? We instituted a net zero regime that makes it possible for the most advantage of us to delay doing what we all know we need to do. Yeah, so it is, I really do want to talk to you guys, so I'm going to wrap up without talking too much more. We know what we need to do to improve the regime. There's a really nice set of recommendations from the United Nations on how we can improve our carbon accounting such that it has a better chance of actually reducing emissions, separating this idea of gross emission reduction from all this other removal stuff is the first and best idea, I think, but there are lots of other ones, including not allowing people simultaneously to work to delay transition. Yeah, I gave you some examples from Kant of the thing I summarized a while ago. Like I say, if you take a look at how this 18th century guy recommended we deal with this problem, that we have a clear goal that we are prevented from reaching by the way we mediate our relations with each other now. Right? He really does provide a sort of comforting and plausible way to move forward. And one thing that I think about that, this is often like derided as old-fashioned, especially this one, right? Use science in the public sphere to drive incremental progress. These days, people are quite cynical about that. And here's what I have to say to that objection. I imagine that you're looking at the Earth from the broken world perspective and make it even more distant, make it a cosmological perspective. You're not from the Earth. When you're observing the outcome of, they failed to constrain themselves and they ended up with a broken world and justice was no longer possible for them, mere existence was what they got with a small rump collection of the species that used to exist. People taking that view, I think, might see 18th century Kantian social contract theory as our best shot at achieving a reasonable commitment mechanism. But there's no reason for us to think from a cosmological perspective that the latest, greatest justice system is also the most effective. So it's true that this is old-fashioned, but I think from a broader perspective, it seems to me to be our best shot. Yeah, so this is just a quote from Duncan McLaren, who's been thinking for years about how to improve net zero. He has the same sorts of suggestions I mentioned earlier. It's, again, the analogy with Akerlof and Stiglitz really applies, right? Let us actually post the box rather than use a system that allows us to deny that we're ever going to get to box posting. And so I think the overall sort of takeaway from the talk is that we really do need to move beyond net zero language, if not the regime, certainly not the regime, right? Right, at this time in history, particularly arguing against the Paris Agreement is very counterproductive. And I wouldn't want to do that. But I would like us to talk less about net zero and more about near zero. Thank you.